I feel compelled to talk to you about baseball, just for a bit. As you know, Chicago is in a bit of a historic moment right now. Whether you love baseball, follow it or not, this is the first time we've had a World Series game at Wrigley Field. We've had World Series games here before, thanks to the Chicago, or more recently, thanks to the Chicago White Sox. But yes, but the friendly confines have not seen this kind of action for over 70 years. And I just thought there must be some resonance for you. I don't think that a Mets fan is necessarily analogous to a Cubs fan. But you've suffered as Chicagoans.
Well, baseball
have.
is suffering. Yeah. I mean, you guys shouldn't, you have a distinction here. Maybe you don't want to let go of it. So, it's, okay. I tried. But, even the Yankees fans, those loathsome humans, they lose 3/4 of the time. I mean, it's pain. But on the other hand, it's a very manageable pain because it's part of this sort of world within the world that you can pretend is very important and get totally invested in, and then it sort of evaporates and real life floods back in. I always feel when the Mets are eliminated, that happened to us, a couple of weeks ago. I want it so much, and I'm so invested in it. There's so much yearning, so much desire associated with it, and then the moment the person from the other team is catching the last out and the dream is over, you're like, oh God, I get my life back. So it's a sort of really it's all about the yearning and the sweet hopefulness, and then every once in a while this crazy feeling. It's funny because I mainly see baseball now through the eyes of my two boys, who are really crazy about it, but they're on to me. They can see when I'm moved to tears by something, so they are constantly needling me and saying, Daddy, how would you act if the Mets won the World Series? I say, well, I'd jump up and down a lot, and they'd say, and you'd cry. And I'm like, I'd cry.
You'd be in good company. There's been a lot of crying over the last few weeks. Yeah. Here, tears of joy. And hopefully they will not turn into tears of sorrow.
No, it's going to be a long series. That's my prediction.
Yes.
Safe prediction.
Well, let's move on to the real world, as you say, to the world of literature and A Gambler's Anatomy. And I read somewhere that after, the epic Dissident Gardens, your fantastic previous novel, which involved a lot of research, a lot of time writing, covered a huge span of time, history, particular kind of slice of American politics and activism, that you wanted to write something just for yourself. Book for you. Yeah,
I began writing novels that came almost completely out of imaginative, personal associations, things I liked, other artworks that I liked, and dreams, my own pie-eyed, strange imaginings. And I thought that was what I would always do. And I very slowly, in writing those books about New York, really it begins with Fortress of Solitude, where I took on the legacy of the prehistory of the gentrification of Boerum Hill, the place I'd grown up in. I suddenly felt like I took it on my back like a snail shell and carried it around, which was great. It was an amazing, rewarding thing, and it's exciting to write books that have like constituencies, stakeholders, people who really are invested in the cultural or social histories that you're exploring, and will let you know if you get them wrong. That's big and really fun. But I reached definitely a kind of culmination in a way with Dissident Gardens. And it wasn't even that the book took me so long to write. All my novels seem to take me about 2.5 to 3 years to actually write. But then in the middle of that project, I realized I'd carved out such a gigantic subject, and I had to learn what the American left meant to me, but also to itself, how it felt to be part of it in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. All things I had intuitions about, but I had to learn so many different things. And I talk about having a book where there were, constituencies of both the living and the dead sort of at my shoulder. I felt this immense, sense of involvement and implication and responsibility that was exciting. But when I got done, I conceived of going back, in a way, to being a storyteller. and making up something where no one could get angry at me, short of maybe like 2 or 3 backgammon experts.
Right. That would be interesting to hear about. Yeah, so here we have this, let me see if I can get this. He's a globe-trotting, high-stakes, backgammon gambler who we meet as he's in the midst of a streak of bad luck at the board.
Yeah.
He tries to turn that around, and then he runs into even worse luck when he discovers he has this growth, this tumor right in the middle of his face, like that alien creature from the films. And in getting that fixed, in order to fix that, if you can fix it, he's required to return to the place he fled as a youth, Berkeley, where he is saved, but then he kind of ends up almost like a sideshow freak, wandering Telegraph Avenue, squashed under the thumb of a former high school chum.
Yeah.
So lesson that for you.
Right. Well, so it's really I would say it's a story that's a kind of a descent. It's a nightmare journey. It's akin to my teenage love of like Twilight Zone episodes, and at the same time, reading Kafka. The idea of the identity that disintegrates and the person who enters a kind of nightmare by degrees, and this uncanny feeling that the world is somehow turned against you. And it, I guess it's a tone you experience in some like late David Cronenberg movies too, something like Dead Ringers, that you're moved very incrementally out of a sense of normalcy, and the characters moved out of a sense of control or self-possession into this realm of the uncanny, bad luck at the highest possible level, existential bad luck, right? Yeah. And I wanted it to be very fun and very absurd, but also I hope kind of mesmerizing and scary. What happens to my guy, to Alexander Bruno, I used settings that were familiar to me in a way, but I didn't, it's not, this book isn't connected to place in the same sense that like those New York books are. I lived in Berkeley for 10 years, and I worked right on Telegraph Avenue as a bookseller. And that world, that strange stretch of Telegraph that's, it's like Haight-Ashbury or a couple of other places in America, is sort of in a kind of frozen 1960s moment forever. There's People's Park across the way, which is, it's really like the first Occupy, before the idea even existed. And it's still occupied continuously. The campus has never claimed it back from the people. But of course, what that produces is a perplexity. What is this thing for? Is it a symbol of freedom, or is it a symbol of the failure of the left? And those questions, anyone who's read my work knows that those questions kind of bedevil me. And Berkeley is a real emblem of, all the contradictions that come out of that. Yeah. So that's part of the backdrop. But I also was living in Berlin for 5 months. I was staying at the American Academy, and I wanted to write about an expatriate. I wanted to kind of do like a Graham Greene thing, where my character would be the ugly American abroad. And I've never really written sections of a book that were set in other countries before. So I did both Berlin and Singapore in this case. Yeah.
I really like the structure of the book, and I don't know, I'd love to talk to you about backgammon and gambling, but I was thinking, because the chapters are sort of the way you count in backgammon, is that?
Yeah, the chapters are numbered like the sides of the gambling die, which is that extra cube that comes in your backgammon set that's for the gambler. It goes, 2, 4, 8, 16, 24, and so anyway, but it's exponential that way, which is the trouble you can get yourself into. Yeah. One moment you're just doubling, and then you're doubling the double, and so forth. And so I wanted the mounting crisis in the story to have that same feeling of slippage, like you'd lost more than you realized before you knew it.
And a feeling of kind of almost moving around the board, because there's a great opening scene, as you say, in Berlin, where Bruno arrives and he goes to play what his manager, his overlord, maybe.
It's sort of like his gambling pimp.
Yes, yeah. Calls a great, a great whale, like someone
Right.
that you're going to be able to take a lot
Rich
of
guy
money
who
from.
doesn't know how bad he is at backgammon.
Right.
Should be a perfect mark.
Right, and has a great name, Wolf Dick Kohler. Just like, there's just this element of, Bond-esque villain or something
Yeah.
about him. But, that is just a moment. Like, it isn't a character that he becomes embroiled in, and necessarily something happens there that turns him in a different direction.
Right.
But then he starts kind of bouncing around, and I felt like there's a way in which the narrative didn't necessarily pile up or knit together in the way you might expect it to, right?
Yeah.
With the
Yeah, I wanted it to seem that it was taking you to places you weren't. I mean, that's just the kind of reading I like best.
Yeah,
When
yeah.
when you can turn the page and find that it's the same book but a different book, that something's changed.
Yeah.
And so you're right. In a way, the geography of this book becomes like a route into the unexpected. You know?
And just that sense of like a game or whatever,
Yeah.
whatever the next hand is or throw, then
Yeah.
something else happens. It felt like there was some analogy there.
That's good. I like the description. That's great.
But I know that you talked about you're fascinated by gambling and have been for a long time. So it seemed maybe that was another unknown for you to tackle. But
Yeah.
what and why backgammon?
Yeah. Well, so there's two answers. I mean, I've always liked gambling stories in fiction and films. I find my attention quickens, and I just think something good is going to happen, not to the characters, but in the story. The pressure is good, and it's taken me a long time to even identify why I like it so much. But I'm thinking of things like Walter Tevis's The Hustler, which was turned into the great Paul Newman film directed by Robert Rawson. And both the novel and the movie are terrific. And Don Carpenter is this Northern Californian writer I love, who writes very, very brilliantly both about pool sharks, but also about like all-night poker games, the special atmosphere that prevails when men gather to do this thing where they're sort of pretending it's just for play, but there's enormous amounts of vanity at stake. Going back to also film noir, like Bob Le Flambour, the great French film noir about the Baccarat, the doomed Baccarat player,
Yeah.
and even Dostoevsky. The first Dostoevsky I ever read was The Gambler, because I was a kid and I was looking for the short one. I don't know, it seeped very deep into my sense of how, in a way, gambling is like another version of what Bob Dylan says about art. Art is designed to destroy time. And I think something about the playing board or the game board or the gambling table, it's like a microcosm. It's a place where you can go to push reality to the edges, and there's nothing else. And the stakes are both hugely important and totally ridiculous. But while the game is on, that's everything. Yeah. And I like that as a kind of attempt. It's like an attempt to control the world by reducing it just to the size of the backgammon or whatever the game is in question. As for backgammon itself, I played it as a teenager. I was very seduced by its combination of being kind of lackadaisical. It seems very simple. It's just a race, and the dice are determining a lot of what happens. So you can not take it too personally if you lose. It's good for just having like conversation and hanging out, and the fact that it also can be taken very seriously. The theory of it and the strategy is very intricate, and people that are good at it can argue about it or talk about it as much as chess players. But it signifies in funny ways. It's very ancient. It goes back to like Mesopotamia. So it's one of the oldest games people play. But it's also seems sort of like an embarrassing afterthought. It's like that extra game inside your chessboard. Like, what's that? I don't know, just close it up. And it turns out, I found this out, people tend to associate it with the 70s. Well, it's not accidental that they do, because it reached, for almost arbitrary reasons, it reached its belated world peak in popularity in the 1970s. It became a craze, and people bought sets and learned to play and wrote books about it. And so I think in the kind of the collective subconscious, you picture like backgammon set open at the Playboy Mansion and two men, with a fireplace and amber fluid studying a very interesting backgammon problem. It seems sort of embarrassing or corny in a way.
Right.
And I like that it had all these messy signifiers loaded into it. So
that was so now that we've kind of set up a little bit about the book and Bruno, maybe you want to read a little passage.
Sure, I'll read a couple pages.
Give a flavor of that, the doomed gambler.
Okay. Well, so this
is
him at his early worst in the book. So right after this first failed confrontation, he's been sent by his handler to take a lot of money away from this rich German guy in the suburbs of Berlin, and failed totally because he was, first of all, he was playing very badly, but also the neurological condition that's overcoming him, which obscures his vision partly, has kept him from playing well. But then he has like a seizure and a nosebleed and falls over, and the guy calls a limo and sends him away to the hospital. And he's sent to this very famous hospital in Berlin that I became very fascinated by, called Charité, which is in the center of the oldest part of Berlin, and its origins are as a plague asylum. So it has that European thing of just being totally rooted in, the medieval, and yet it's also a modern hospital, and was very important in the Cold War because it was right on the edge of the wall on the eastern side. So it was the best medical facility behind the Iron Curtain, and rich Russians would come all the way to East Berlin to be treated there. And the nurses and orderlies during the wall years had to be trained in how to not only take care of patients, but also prevent people, once they were well enough to jump out the windows into the West, from doing so. So they were your nurse and your captor if you were in the hospital. Anyway, he's taken there. They don't think anything's much wrong with him. They don't do a CAT scan or anything. They just think he's kind of a drunk. And they release him, and it's early the next morning, and he's walking back out of the hospital kind of in a daze. All he has with him is his backgammon case from the gambling of the night before, and he's wearing his tuxedo, which is stained with blood from his nosebleed, so he looks kind of ridiculous and disreputable. And he falls again, and he suffers another brief seizure and falls into the roadway between the big hospital and the big train station called the Hauptbahnhof in Berlin. I think I'll just read a couple pages of this crisis, this fall. As he slid into the morning crowds approaching the sun-twinkling central glass atrium at the Hauptbahnhof, the train station, another city unto itself, more chilly and anonymous than the medieval campus of Charité, but also, therefore, more familiar with its sushi express and Burger King and international newsstand, its dozens of tracks leading anywhere he might wish to escape to. There Bruno fell, not across the train station's threshold, but before it, just past a construction barricade at the river side of the station entrance. He fell into a shallow rupture in the walkway, a section where the cobblestones had been disrupted, the earth below laid bare. See, that's page 30, and I already have so much to explain to you. He's, earlier in the book, become fascinated, arbitrarily it seems, with these cobblestones, which are everywhere in Berlin. They're used to make the sidewalks all throughout the city, and there are these cubes of granite, roughly cut into cubes, that are just pounded flat into the earth, very simply, to make the walkways and the sidewalks everywhere. And he's noticed that when they come up, that workmen come along and just pound them back into the earth with this sort of like a big wooden mallet, like he would use to bonk a clown on the head or something. And it just strikes him as weirdly primitive and ancient. And but also the squareness of the cubes reminds him of his dice. He fell into a shallow rupture in the walkway, a section where the cobblestones had been disrupted. The earth below laid bare. A small pile of the granite paving cubes lay to one side, at a point now level to his view. Bruno's legs had gone. He didn't try to stand again. The blot made everything confusing. This is the black floater, giant black floater in his visual field. The blot made everything confusing. His backgammon set was clutched to his chest, still or again. He saw the station looming, a Zeno's paradox target now. He'd been nearer to it standing on the other side of the river. The front of his face bled again. He moved his legs now, but only swam in the dirt and the rubble of stones. No one paid attention. He smelled dust, mud, sunlight, and grilling sausages, nauseating so early in the morning. If only he had a wooden mallet, Bruno could pretend to be working. Did a vast supply of older cobblestones circulate throughout Berlin, endlessly repurposed? Or did fresh ones need to be quarried and shaped? What would happen if he kidnapped a stone and took it out of circulation? Would the whole system collapse? Bruno could enjoy contemplating the rough cubes forever, now that they'd captivated his imagination, if he only weren't lying sideways, watching blood from his nose drip into the dusty soil. If only he weren't embarrassed to be seen here. Time slipped from him in blacked-out instants, like a film in which one blotted passerby was replaced by the next, a jump cut. How ironic, he thought, that behind him, across the river, on the idyllic hospital campus, a crumpled figure would surely find himself swarmed by compassionate attention, the medical students competing to show off their training. On this side of the bridge, below the edifice of the train station, he lay beneath consideration, resembling as he did the contemptible derelicts and drifters accumulating at major train stations all over the universe. For amusement, Bruno reached out for one of the squarish stones. The result was more than he could have hoped for. He'd unknowingly been touching at his nose or lip. The fingers that seized up the stone dotted it with brash, bloody fingerprints. 3 fingertip prints on one face of the stone, a thumbprint on another. A 3-1, always a pleasant roll at the start of a game. But Bruno had decided to give up backgammon, so never mind. He brought the blood-stained cobblestone nearer. Touching his nose again, there was plenty of blood. He carefully daubed the remaining faces, making a 2, a 4, a 5, and a 6. Between glaring sun and absorbent stone, the dots of fresh blood dried almost instantly. The challenge was to keep from staining the stone further. Bruno wiped his fingers on his shirt, which had been sacrificed hours ago. The task was amusing enough to distract him from the matter of the opinions of passers-by. When the rough granite die was complete, he rotated it in all directions to confirm that he'd made no error. No, it was perfect. Bruno grunted in satisfaction. Then he opened his backgammon case, which was itself printed with flurries of reddish fingerprints. There, to accompany the 2 sets of wooden dice, the blonde and the ebony, and his doubling cube, he pushed the giant stone die inside. He was just able to clasp the set around it, then let the entirety slip from his arms into the sidewalk's seam, into the dust. That this blunt object would damage the smooth inlaid wood of his board, Bruno was certain. He didn't care. The cobblestone die might be the most valuable thing he owned. It was proof, at least, of what Berlin otherwise denied, that he existed here, now. There you go. Thank you. Thanks.
So that kind of ends with that idea you were talking about earlier, the sort of instability of identity that's a through line of a lot of your writing. But as you say, there's many things going on with this character, the tumor, but also his belief that he has an ability to do what he calls thought transferring.
Yeah, he's grown up believing that he has a kind of ESP.
Yeah.
And if you believe him, which is possible, it's possible also to disbelieve him, I think, for the reader of the book. But if you believe him, it's a pathetic ESP because he can't ever use it effectively. It never helps him with anything.
Yeah. It's just something he tries to escape.
Yes, he mostly doesn't like it, and and then when he tries to exhibit it, it never seems to manifest.
Right. It may just be a sensitivity to other people's voices.
He's like the invisible guy who's only invisible when no one's looking.
Right. Yeah. So. He undergoes this. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about, in terms of thinking about research and how you write about the unknown, and that is sort of like the space for imaginative, experience.
Yeah.
He undergoes this radical facial surgery. Essentially removing his face in order to remove the tumor. And there's a whole set piece. There's a doctor, Noah Berenger, who is another baseball fan. So a Jimi Hendrix fan. And at the end of this book, you thank like 6 or 7 doctors, including the tall blonde. So, can can you talk a little bit about why you decided, like this is a big hinge, if there are multiple hinges in this book, a big hinge is when he undergoes his surgery and then is spat out and goes on another series of misadventures.
Yeah, I wanted to write a book. In a way, I had a model that I borrowed from Don DeLillo's White Noise, which is a book about a suburban family in a college town, and then there's this catastrophic toxic airborne event in their town, and it turns into a book about trauma and about recovery and about death in the second half. And the toxic airborne event is this chapter in the middle of the book that just cleaves the book in two. There's a before and after, and so it defies the typical structure of a book where the biggest possible thing happens at the end. In this case, the big thing is like a bomb that drops in the middle, and you have a before and after. The surgery is the shape of the book is similar around this surgery, and I wanted there to be this radical deconstruction of Alexander Bruno's face and identity, in a sense. And then the question of the second half of the book is, can he be put back together? And can he believe in himself again? Can he reassume anything of who he was before? And so here I was, bragging that I was going to write a no research book, and I did have to figure out how to make the surgical section persuasive, but I also really wanted it to be, in a way I wanted the reader to survive a traumatic sequence he does, and so that you really feel the impact of it, and know what was at stake. And I did end up doing a lot of due diligence with neurosurgeons and figuring out, even though I was going to exaggerate and make it in some ways a slightly gothic version of Western medicine, my own nightmare version, I wanted it to seem credible enough. And I also knew that, down the avenue of research would come interesting things. I mean, you mentioned Atul Gawande. Well, he was the one who told me about a surgeon who played incredibly loud Jimi Hendrix in an operating theater, as a way of asserting his authority and creating an atmosphere that other people might find obnoxious, but was the right one for him to concentrate on taking your brain apart. And I just latched onto that. It was so perfect. Yeah. But there's a little bit of a joke in the acknowledgments, because I have like 3 or 4 real doctors acknowledged, and then I had 3 or 4 other people, including my wife. And once I had doctor in front of the first ones, I just started putting doctor in front of them all. So it includes some non-doctor doctors.
Well, there's something in that, the imposter. I mean, the doctor himself, the persona he has to create, right? I mean, through the loud music, through his interest in sort of scatological humor, because he undergoes these epic, it's like a performance, right? He's like a rock star doing this. That's similar to Bruno, who says like his biggest accomplishment in the book is the creation of his personality, that he's been able to form a personality that is this like kind of suave backgammon gambler.
Yeah, I think there's something to the idea that the surgeon and Bruno are similar brilliant fakes in a way. Yeah. They only do one thing well, and it concentrates a lot of sort of status or allure around them, which they then have to manage or just find a way to live up to. And not that they would recognize one another as kin in the book. They're very alienated by each other, in fact. But I guess I've been fascinated by brain surgery and the role of the neurosurgeon for a long time, and I've read a lot about it. And I think one of the things that I was fooling with in the book was the way in which, in a fairly secular, culture, the priests are these surgeons. They're very, we have the joke in that movie where Alec Baldwin says he's God. But there is this feeling that we believe that if someone can do such a profound intervention, that they are therefore profound. or the fact that they can reach into such a deep part of us means that they understand us deeply. And those two things aren't, of course, exactly the same.
Right.
They're really, in many cases, really extremely good plumbers, basically. They're just good at fixing a meat thing in you, you know? Yeah. And I, you know, there are great exceptions, like Oliver Sacks or Atul Gawande, who are profound humanists as well as gifted surgeons. But I think knowing a lot of them, and with all due respect, a lot of them are fairly, siloed human types. They don't know a lot about very much else. The restrictions of their training, combined with the extreme hierarchy they sit at the top of, and the way everyone defers to them, isolate them quite violently in some ways. And so my surgeon in the book is a joke about a kind of ultimate opposite of Oliver Sacks in a way. The surgeon who really is not, he doesn't have a good soul when you get to know him.
Yeah, he is not attuned to other people in a particular way, which seems like, and the way you just described that seems like why it's interesting. And I know you moved to California recently to have this set in San Francisco or have this set in Berkeley, which is one of those cities that maybe like the Brooklyn you've written about really lays bare the kind of hierarchies of the way society is becoming organized between the haves and the have-nots.
That's true. Though, like the Rebecca Solnit vision of San Francisco, which I glance at in the current scene with the crazy gold rush atmosphere recreated with the tech billionaires and then the camps of the impoverished living under the freeway and so forth. Yeah, it's a very, very stark tableau there right now in particular.
Yeah. It seems then the book kind of pulls a thread from, or continues a thread from Dissident Gardens, which ends with a character who has encountered the Occupy movement and is sort of what role, how will he be involved with them, but ends kind of being scrutinized by the powers that be and calls himself like a cell of one or something. And at the end of this, you have Alexander in his cell of 5 trying to take down the capitalist edifice.
By putting a card in a bank machine.
Right.
It's a sort of an absurd vision of the revolutionary cell. But,
right. I guess I'm just curious about like this moment of politics. What's happening right now. You wrote somewhere that you like to write about those from whom the ground has been pulled out from under them, and the world that they were, like your character Alexander Bruno, where they thought they were headed is not at all where they're going, and things can be taken or turned upside down immediately. And I thought, there's so many people who could occupy that position right now in the real world, like refugees, supporters of Donald Trump, people who are drawn to the Black Lives Matter movement, and I wondered. I mean, what you're making of this kind of broader political and economic sort of scene that you're writing in right now, that is, I wonder what context that's giving to the unstable identity
I think that there is a way in which I opened doors in myself and in my work in Dissident Gardens that couldn't help but stay open and flow into this project. And there's a funny way in which the last time Alexander Bruno has a glimpse of his mother, she's pushing a shopping cart full of recyclables down a side street off People's Park. And he's a very strange character in the sense that he self-defines himself as a kind of almost like a James Bond, someone with consummate white privilege, literally in a white tuxedo, floating through international glamorous locales, casinos and so forth. And yet what the book demonstrates is that he's a homeless guy with no health insurance, relying on the pity of others, and that the difference is tissue thin. And yet he has no way to, because he's so dedicated to his self-invention, which also consists of amnesia, not knowing where he's from, not understanding his place in the social order, not even seeing the social order. And this is a subject that predates Distant Gardens for me. It goes all the way back to my first couple of novels. Gun with Occasional Music and Amnesia Moon are partly about cultural amnesia, about the powerlessness that comes from not recognizing class and history and your participation and culpability in a social order, but people floating in a kind of fantasy vacuum of these things. Chronic City is the same way.
So you have written, I mean, I was surprised when you said that, you know, San Francisco doesn't, it's not quite the same place, I mean, I get that, the same place, or maybe it doesn't have that power of place as like a place like Brooklyn does, you know, and you're famous for, in your novels, really drilling down. So it's not just Brooklyn, it's like Court Street or Dean Street, or, you know, maybe Park Avenue, East 86, Queens, Sunnyside. I wonder what you think, given having written this great epic about, again, this multi-generational family, all of whom go through periods of, you know, the American left and how it expresses itself, from communism to, you know, protest and folk music to getting involved in, like, the Sandinistas to Occupy.
Right.
How you look at someone like Donald Trump, who emerges out of that same milieu of Queens and, you know, I just wonder if you, looking back and sort of thinking about, you know, he's kind of a classic New Yorker in some way.
It's very weird from the New York perspective. I mean, my nickname for him is Archie Bunker Lusconi. And, you know, I got very involved in thinking about Archie Bunker again, because I made a chapter of Dissident Gardens where the grandmother ends up in a kind of a dream marriage to Archie Bunker. She kind of floats into an episode of All in the Family because she so powerfully identifies with his persona as a aggrieved, you know, working class person from Queens, and yet, of course, his politics are so abhorrent to her, and she wants to somehow, you know, excuse me, but like fuck some sense into him. You know, she's like, if only I could, you know, make Archie Bunker into a socialist, then we would, you know, then the and that's, of course, that's the fantasy, right? If you could turn the grievances of Trump's disenfranchised into what seems to be its raw desire, at least in my projection, for, you know, for a complete rethinking of how we, you know, how we deal with poverty and the working class and the rich. Needless to say, Trump is this bizarro vehicle for these kinds of thoughts, right? He doesn't make any sense at all, and he's very embarrassing. You know, when I think about the fact that he and my mother both grew up in Queens, and they're sort of contemporaries, it's really strange for me. I feel very sad that this, like, the civilizing power of New York identity didn't do anything there. You know, it really humbles, you know, my vanity about, like, what it is to be part of the cosmopolitan world. That it would seem to me just, you know, would put certain kinds of sensibilities, inject certain kinds of sensibilities into anyone growing up in that era in New York City with what was going on and available, and, you know, but I know that money is an incredible inoculator against taste and sense. It's perfect. It puts a perfect seal on those things.
Yeah. I think I'm getting signals that it's time to take questions. There you all are.
I wonder if you would talk about, as a novelist, the decision to take yourself and a reader through what you described as the traumatic center, the surgery, where you have to immerse yourself in the research and the understanding, and you sort of grit your teeth and then present it to a reader and know they're also going to...
Yeah. Well, the reader doesn't have to look at the YouTube videos, though.
Thank you.
But, yeah, all right, so why am I inflicting this torment in a way. The first thing to say is you can put the book down, right? No one is going to dictate, and this is always the answer about eccentric decisions I make or commitments I make in my work. I'm not going to presume they're for every person, but I've been increasingly aware of how I've always gravitated towards a certain kind of fear or disquiet or even horror in my interest in both books and movies. It's something I held at arm's length for a long time. Actually, as someone who really loves a lot of genre, I never really thought I liked things that were called horror. I always thought, I'm into dystopian science fiction, and I love hard-boiled detective stories, and I like even obscure kind of genre modes that I identify, like the academic satire, and I tried to write one of those. Or in film, I like westerns very much. And I always thought I didn't like horror. But then I started to notice that some of what I liked was horror sort of with a disguise of something else on it. That by loving, for instance, I mentioned this already once, The Twilight Zone so much. It was really that when I was, what was I staying up late as a 10-year-old and watching Channel 11 in New York after I should have been in bed about, but to be scared by Rod Serling's vision of things. And this came partly because he was connecting with the world I grew up in. I'm a late instance, but I think I'm a definite product of Cold War fear, the kind of hard rain's going to fall, fallout shelter, anxiety was really inside me very deeply. I've come to see how much it formed my worldview. It made me ready, for instance, to be interested in J.G. Ballard and Philip K. Dick, these science fiction writers who wrote about a kind of doomy planetary vision, and sometimes specifically wrote about post-apocalyptic things. And I also realized that a lot of films I like had a kind of uncanny psychological disquiet, or what Freud calls the uncanny, the unheimlich in them, or Edgar Allan Poe, that I like dread and this atmosphere more than I admitted. And so I began to think, why is it and what do I connect it to? And I was looking at this moment and realizing that all fear, collective fear, is what's being manipulated in our cultural and political world so aggressively since 9/11. That's just driving so much of how things are imposed, or the way conversations are directed about what we can want or should want in our daily lives, or what we need to do to protect ourselves. So I became more actively interested in this, and I've never really written a book that had any kind of like read it with your hands over your eyes kind of sequence. And so I just wanted to, in the spirit also of I'm always trying to do something I've never done before, I wanted to find a way to do that.
Were you reading any horror in order to?
Well, some. I mean, I was reading the kinds of, I guess you'd call it sort of gentrified. I mean, what I like, I like early Ian McEwan novels. Another book that has the same interesting shape, deformation in the middle that I was describing in Don DeLillo's White Noise, is an Ian McEwan novel called The Innocent, where there are these lovers in Berlin in the early phase of the division of the city who are implicated in a kind of espionage plot, but they're also very innocent, and they're very naive, and then they half accidentally kill someone, and to cover it up they have to take the corpse apart. And the middle of that book has this section where they're just disposing of the corpse, and McEwan does it in painstaking detail, and the reader has to undergo something to read that part of the book, and it's so well done, and it is so extraordinary, and you're so committed to the characters that you go through it with them. But on the other side of it, it's like the airborne toxic event. Something has changed, and they're changed. Their innocence has been stripped from them, and you feel you're in a different book from there on. And that also was a model for this. And I was looking at films. I mean, I mentioned Cronenberg, that body horror and that sense of existential unease that you associate with like late Cronenberg films. Everything after like Videodrome. was very important to me in thinking about the tone of this book. But also his willingness to make it absurd and silly, too. Because I think that just as the doctor becomes ridiculous in the middle of the surgery, he starts, as you say, he's got this horrible bawdy conversation that he has with the nurses. There's this tone of how absurd our fears can be at the same time.
This might be too simple of a question, but as a writer, somebody who's very interested in immersing yourself in projects that also include research, and as somebody who is so interested in fiction and has written such great novels, what is your relationship to the internet? Like, how do you deal with it? And what's, maybe on a day-to-day basis or just in general, how do you think about those rabbit holes and all of that, all of those places you can go? Just curious.
Yeah. The places you can go. Well, and it's a great question. I mean, first of all, on a really practical level of just keeping myself on the balance beam, I use an internet blocking program called Freedom. I mean, it seems really dorky to need that, but it's really interesting. I think a lot of writers need that and use that one or some other one. And it's the simplest, it's like a baseline intervention. You just cut it off, right? And it can seem like you're sacrificing something, and people will say, oh, I couldn't write without the ability to flip over and do research. But actually, you can just put a placeholder in where you need to get the name of something right and go back and fill those things in later. It's really okay. And the more interesting part of your question is, my relationship to it is something that's a constant negotiation. And sometimes I feel really alive to the rabbit holes and happy to be able to fly into them in different ways. And other times it seems really intolerable to me and really problematic. And I'm sure that that's true for almost everyone in different ways, that you have an ambivalent relationship to this, this kind of riot of information and energy and imagery that's just right there at your fingertips. It's something I think it's almost impossible to be other than ambivalent about. Right now I'm thinking a lot about preferring not to, and part of that is being on book tour. I don't look at a lot of things that I might in other times look at more eagerly, because I don't want to see how mean everyone's being about me and my book. I mean, it's really like self-preservation. It's so psychologically degrading. And now I'm speaking from a position of privilege and luxury. That anyone cares at all about my book is something I should remember to be grateful for, and I am very much so. But of course, it's a reminder that even that someone with my privileges can be made to feel so upset that other people thrust into that situation involuntarily and suffering enormously in all sorts of ways that are, slippery slopes that they can't get out of. That's a really concerning reality, and we're all subject to at least little tastes of it at times, and people who suffer make large doses. I think it's really an enormously intricate problem. As someone also raising children who are sort of still young enough to be under my umbrella of what kind of screen life they have, but that's going to change. They're going to want their own screen life. I'm very conscious of that, right? And I don't just mean no porn, but the social experience of being mediated in so many different ways. I felt the onset of that in my, I'm a pretty late adopter, sort of in my early 40s. And it was still hard to manage where I wanted to be and how much, But to grow up in that world, well, maybe you'd be more adept in many ways, but I think also the sense of involuntary, complicity, just needing to be represented there and find your way through it seems really crazy. Yeah, okay, well that was a lot. I'll stop there. I see other hands are up. Yeah. Great.
This is a simpler question.
Sure.
I read Motherless Brooklyn, and I was both, I was laughing, and also it evoked a lot of pathos in me, the Tourette's character.
Thank you.
Who's the main character.
Yeah.
And I was wondering why you came to choose that Tourette's syndrome, what connection you have to it, if any.
Well, I mean, in a way, it connects to what I just said was my standing interest in neurology and the brain, you know, as the seat of consciousness and the dream life and all the things that a novelist would normally engage with, but also the kind of mechanics, or the fact that it's also a kind of a, you know, something people are trying to quantify how it works and why we feel and think what we do. And I encountered, you know, when I conceived to write that book, it was 1997, 96 or 97, Tourette's wasn't as disseminated in the culture by any measure. You know, and I don't mean to credit myself, but I just think it's been in so many TV shows and movies, and it's become something, if a comedian makes a joke about it, we all recognize that, but that wouldn't be true at that time. It was, you know, a word that was known by the people who themselves or their families were dealing with it, and not so much otherwise. And I read about it in an essay by Oliver Sacks, and I felt this overwhelming sense of identification and excitement that I couldn't even really organize. It just seemed really meaningful to me. And, you know, probably in some ways that were about feeling that, you know, it had told me something about myself, about my relationship to language, the compulsive aspect of my desire to, you know, manipulate language and use it to throw out of me into the world. It just seemed like it was telling me a thing about my own brain, which is not just to claim the burden of the suffering of someone who has been diagnosed with Tourette's as my own, because I haven't had that road in life. But then I just saw it as such an amazing vehicle for thinking about consciousness and language and self and world, you know, the boundary between self and world, which is really a novelist's primary, you know, area of operation. It just seemed really, really charged, and I felt like I knew almost instantly I was going to write about it. And then the rest was conceiving a vehicle that would allow me to, you know, the character and the detective story and putting it in Brooklyn all came subsequently. Thanks.
You have talked about a sort of an intellectual analysis in your book of somebody's their pain.
Yes.
And I was wondering, have you looked at the other side, the side of people that have experienced pain or things that have happened to them, you know, that they couldn't help? In other words, is that explored in your book, or have you?
Do you mean in A Gambler's Anatomy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I guess I don't see it as an either or, exactly as your question presupposes. I mean, I don't need to be dodgy about this because it's very widely known. My interest in neurosurgery and the brain comes from the fact that my mother died when I was a kid with a brain tumor. And she had two surgeries, one successful in that it bought her 3 years of life, more or less as she'd known it before. And then the second, where it was unsuccessful, you know, kind of 11th hour attempt to stop the regrowing tumor, and she died a few months after that and was very impaired by that second surgery. So to me, the pain is right in there with the interest. And, you know, I've written almost endlessly about the meaning of this giant, you know, I speak about a before and after where trauma comes and intervenes, you know, in my description, the way I characterize Don DeLillo's book or Ian McEwan's book. I guess my own life has this trauma and before and after, you know, this big event that disorganizes your sense of stability or even identity in the world, and then you have to figure out who you are after and what comes after. So I'd be very sorry if I believed that it was a choice between my intellectual desire to frame and explore these things and my embodiment of the emotional stakes, which are always there as well. And actually, I feel this is a pretty emotional book for me, and I made sure that I felt, that Bruno, as silly as he is in some ways, he's a preposterous figure who was cut down to size. He also is someone I ached for all the way through and suffered with all the way through. So for me, the two things can coexist. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, he has a very different journey than someone like Lionel Essrig in Motherless Brooklyn, which seems like such a classic quest, where he does kind of come out the other side of that quest. He's able to answer some questions. He's able to formulate a self, in relationship to all of these things that formed him that he didn't fully understand. He's able to kind of grasp them.
Yeah, Bruno is sort of denied the gift of self-knowledge, but maybe he does survive, at least. I'll say that.
Yes, we won't say more than that. In interesting form. But so I have two really quick questions just to answer and us. One is, we talk at the Humanities Festival about like celebrating the social life of ideas, right? That you need community, you need to be connected to one another in order for those ideas really to fully take shape. People come here to hear you, but then what do they do? Where do they go in the world with those things? So how do you celebrate that in your own life?
Well, I mean, it's very stark for me at the moment because I feel, that the real meaning of, writers do a very antisocial thing in a sense. They go off into hiding and make this elaborate thing that has no clear social purpose. And then you come out and you're exhibiting it and trying to help people define it and measure its value without becoming solipsistic. There's no one who needs to read my work, but it means an enormous amount to me that people do, and that I also get to come out of my hiding and see a room full of faces is an extraordinary thing. And I'm also, I'm a teacher, and so I think about fiction as social practice in a very immediate day-to-day way in the classroom because of people's desire to understand themselves and experience themselves and their world in narrative, in stories. And that this, when my 18 or 19-year-old students are in that workshop class, they're not just thinking, I want to someday, have a book and be famous. They're reaching for something that is a conversation that with the literature, the stories that has, pulled them out of themselves, and they're trying to talk back to it and move into that register themselves, which is all I was ever trying to do. I really, when I was a kid, I just wanted to be in the world of the books that I loved and talk back to them and explore what I could say in those terms. But it's not a solitary act. In that desire, it's a very social, a very communal act, in fact. It's like I want to be, I don't want to be the only novelist. I want to be on the shelves in conversation with all of those other books.
Right. And then just quickly, you invoked the teacher, so give us some homework. In addition to reading your book, A Gambler's Anatomy, which I highly recommend, what else should we read? What are you really excited to be reading right now? What would you recommend?
I'm not reading all particularly new stuff at the moment, but I've just been actually reading and rereading books by a writer who I think is pretty well out of print, but maybe we can all change that here today. Laurie Colwin, this remarkable novelist, who I just finished reading a novel of hers called Family Happiness, and marvelous, humane, social satirist, feminist author without being programmatic in any way, but just her I think all of the people who are currently reading the Ferrante novels, I mean, they're at a slightly less epic pitch than the Ferrante, but in terms of the intimacy of female experience that you feel you're encountering, she's been really great for me to read and reread lately. What else am I on to just now? Well, something pretty new, fairly new. a British author named Rachel Cusk wrote a book called Outline that's a knockout. It's just, and it's very hard to characterize. It's done in this extremely spare style. It's almost like a kit for assembling a novel. She doesn't do a lot of dialogue or scene setting. She sort of has this narrator who's just telling you enough that you can kind of follow her sensibility through these different situations. But the sensibility is so strong and so rich. So those are a couple of things. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan Lethem. Thank you for being with us. Thank you.